Well, hello and welcome, and thank you for coming to this session on researching Black London with Senate House Libraries resources. This is the first of what we hope will be a series of sessions about researching London, all on different themes. My name is Layla Kassir and I'm one of the presenters today. I am the academic librarian for British, US, Latin American and Caribbean literature. And I'm joined today by Argala Rublak, the history librarian at Senate House Library, and also Dr. Juanita Cox, an academic who's going to be talking to us in a moment. Can we make sure that throughout the session you have your microphones on mute and your cameras turned off, just so as there's no disruption for the other participants? So our aim today is to provide ideas for resources for researching and studying Black literature and history of London, and to suggest some methods and ways in which you can go about this research. The main session will last about 45 minutes and is going to be divided up into 3 little talks of about 15 minutes duration each, and there will therefore be time at the end of the session for questions. We're also going to be circulating after the session a resource list of all the items that we reference throughout. So don't worry if you don't catch everything. We'll be circulating various bits of information after the session as well. So this is the running order. The running order. And so in a moment, we're going to start with Dr. Juanita Cox, who's going to talk about Caribbean literature in London, followed by Argala and myself. So we're very, very happy today to have Juanita Cox with us, and Juanita's specialism is interdisciplinary really, because it lies in post-colonial literature, particularly 20th century Caribbean Anglophone literature, as well as oral history interviewing. And most recently, Juanita has been researching, a research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies here at the School of Advanced Studies, where she's been researching the project Nationality, Identity and Belonging, an oral history of the Windrush generation and their relationship to the British state, 1948 to 2018. So very, very happy to pass over to Juanita to begin the session. So over to you, Juanita.
All right, well, thank you, Argala and Layla, for inviting me to talk about Caribbean literature, specifically in London. I'm going to be focusing on literature that's been produced in the sort of 20th century. I did my own thesis on the shaping of the novels of a Guyanese author called Edgar Mittelhalzer. So the slides are really shaped by my interest in book history and also the sort of historical context of literary production. So I think the first obvious place to go to in London when you're doing research on Caribbean literature is the British Library, which of course is only sort of 10 minutes down the road from Senate House. They are the holder of the largest collection of Caribbean materials in the UK, including publications from Bogle L'Ouverture, New Beacon Books, Hansard Publications, People Tree Books, and, you know, sort of other independent UK presses that are focused on the expression and experience of Caribbean communities in Britain. I haven't, of course, been to the British Library recently due to coronavirus, of course, so I don't know what the latest collections are. I know they are working on building up the Windrush collections, but just to say that there is one on James Berry, who is a poet, who was a poet and writer. The Andrew Salkey collection was donated by his wife Patricia a few years ago. And there is also a new collection now that's available based around Edgar Mittelhalzer's writings. And it's a collection of letters, really, that go between, that are written between him and a friend of his, Ruth Windybank, in Guyana. But it also includes example of self-published collections, you know, like Creole Chips and poems and things like that, which, you know, because of the absence of publishing companies in the Caribbean that he had printed and that he would sort of sell himself. And the other resource that I think is fantastic at the British Library is the Sound Library, especially the Power of Caribbean Poetry Word and Sound collection. You'll find their material from people like Mervyn Morris, you know, Grace Nichols, John Agard, and more contemporary writers like Kay Miller, Linton Kwesi Johnson. So that's always worth researching. The other thing I should mention as well is their newspaper collection. It's really useful when you're looking for reviews of Caribbean literature, but also, because the British Library houses newspapers that were produced in the Caribbean prior to their independence. So you can always find a lot of less well-known writing in the Sunday papers and things like that. But in order to think about sort of where you would find get a strong understanding of book history, I'm just going to provide a quick context about the sort of foundational figures in Caribbean literature, writers who came here in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, people like Jan Carew, Edgar Middlehauser, Camus Brathwaite, Sam Selvon, Andrew Salkey. And they were largely published by people like the Oxford University Press, Longman, Heinemann, Secker, and Wahlberg, Andrew Deutsch. And it's always worth trying to find the archives of those various publishers in order to find out more about book history. But I mention them in order to sort of point out the shift from there being a high interest in Caribbean writers in that early period to the shift away from that, where by the 1950s you see sort of newspaper reviews complaining about Caribbean people who think they know how to use English language better than English people. And you can sort of get a strong sense of the racism of that early period of 1960s literature. And I think as a result of the sort of political change in political climate, there is a corresponding explosion in book publishing and press publishing. And so out of that, you've got 1965, Britain's youngest and first Black woman publisher, Margaret Busby, who's best known for Daughters of Africa, and more recently, the recent publication called New Daughters of Africa. And I mention Margaret particularly because she's a font of extraordinary information, and she was very much part of the whole book publishing scene and remains so. And so if you're trying to find things like private collections within London, she's a great go-to person. I think when I was doing my research into Edgar Middlehauser, one of the things I was very aware was that a lot of the book history is actually still held in private collections and not necessarily as yet in a lot of the archives. I wanted to mention too the New Beacon Books. I mean, it was the first specialist Caribbean publishing company in Britain that was established in 1966 by John LaRose and his partner Sarah White. The bookstore opened in 1973 and of course is still around today. And I'd really encourage everybody to try and support New Beacon Books so that it thrives rather than, it has this long history of surviving in a very difficult book publishing environment. There was also Eric and Jessica Huntley who established the Bogo Louverture in 1969. They had their bookstore in West London in 1982, which ran for 9 years. And then there was Arif Ali as well, who started Hansard Publishing. They had a lot of local Caribbean presses as well that they worked on. And then finally, I just want to mention, so because our Hansard Publications are still around, I thought I'd better mention Centerprise Publications. I think Centerprise was a sort of community centre that was set up in 1971 by Glenn, was set up in 1971 for the Hackney community. And then Glenn Thompson, who was an African American, set up the actual Centerprise Publications. And that sort of ceased publishing in the 1990s. And then the bookstore itself closed in 2020. I'm not sure exactly what's happened to the archives, but I know that you can get some of the material from the website link that I've attached there. And it's just worth checking that because although it was never really a specialist in Caribbean writing and focused primarily on working class writers, there were a lot of, there was a large Caribbean community there, and people, I think there were writers like Dorothea Smart, and other Caribbean writers and authors like that who sort of had their grounding there. I'm going to move quickly to the next slide, just briefly to show you that these are the sort of books that are still available at really competitive prices at New Beacon Books. So rather than going through places like Amazon, again, just to encourage you to go to New Beacon bookstores in Stroud Green Road. And then, of course, above New Beacon Bookstore, there is the George Padmore Institution, and that was founded by John LaRose in 1991, together with people that he was connected with at New Beacon Books. And it's an extraordinary archive that mainly covers the periods 1960s to the 1990s, and is broken into sort of 4 key areas. Now, I'd suggest if you're looking for material that's specifically related to Caribbean authors, have a look at the personal papers of John LaRose and also the Caribbean Artist Movement archives. It contains material from people like Naipaul, Middlehauser, Selvon, again, Brathwaite, John Lamming, Beryl Gilroy, and also Martin Carter. I haven't been there for a while, so I think that's where the archives are still held. But yeah, just check online. Of course, you know, John LaRose was also involved in the international book fairs, or was one of the founder members of the international book fairs of radical Black and Third World books. So too was Bogle Louverture and Race Today, I believe. So material relating to that is also held there. And they have a special issue as well of Savaco from 1974, which provides a really comprehensive anthology of Black writing from that period. And moving on, there's also the London Metropolitan Archives, which currently holds a key number of Black and Caribbean community archives, which that started again with the archives of Eric and Jessica Huntley, and their business was Bogle Louverture Publications. They published a lot of Caribbean literature, particularly people, I guess, like Andrew Solke, but yeah, a lot of people from that early 20th century period. Other people within the archive, I think there's material on Hansib Publications, Cy Grant, there's a Cy Grant collection there as well. And also Dr. Petronella Breinberg, who was an author and playwright from Suriname. But I mention these archives specifically because I think Bogle Louverture also organized a lot of meetings and talks at their bookstore, and had, which involved the participation of key writers like Louise Bennett, you know, Merle Hodge, and others. And then finally, there's the Black Cultural Archives, which includes an ever-growing oral history archive that's fascinating. It's really an archive that reflects the BCA's history as a local grassroots organization. So it has a lot of personal papers, organizational records, photographs, periodicals, a lot of material on sort of political and cultural activism. And so, yeah, again, it's another archive that's really worth looking at. I think just on a sort of final note, I just mentioned that if you're looking for primary material, again, just to reinforce that it's really worth connecting with people that work, you know, community groups, and finding out via them if, you know, who's got what. And also there's the Caribbean Literary Heritage website that's a really good place to start having conversations with other people who are writing on Caribbean literature. And then there's just 2 books I think that's really useful to look at in terms of the context. There's a book by Brian Allen that's called Radicals Against Race, Black Activism and Cultural Politics. It's got some really information, really good information about the John LaRose archives. And then just on a final note, you know, in terms of thinking about 20th century literature, it's really important to remember the role of the BBC Caribbean Voices. And And so have a look as well at the BBC websites, because they have some really interesting material on African and Caribbean writing. But I think that's pretty much it. And I don't know if I've gone over my 15 minutes or not, but I think that covers most of what I want to say. And if anyone has any particular questions, they can always ask me at the end. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Anita, for that amazing introduction to the session. So now we're going to move on to the second part of the session, in which I will introduce you to some resources at Senate House Library to research Black London history. So I'm going to take back control over the slides and move on to the next one here. And what I'll start with is I'll first introduce you to one of our archive collections that we hold at the library, and then I'll also show you an example of an e-resource that you can use for your research. So I'll start us off with the Institute of Commonwealth Studies Archives and Library. So at Senate House Library, we house the library and archive of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. Just to let you know what the Archive and Library is. It was founded by the University of London in 1949 to encourage research into the then only recently created modern Commonwealth of Nations. The library includes a total of 190,000 print volumes, over 9,000 periodical and serial publications, 230 archival collections, and 13,000 different publications issued by political parties, trade unions, and pressure groups from all across the Commonwealth. Today, I will give you an overview over one of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies archival collections, and that is the Billy Strachan papers. So first of all, let's go through who Billy Strachan was and what his papers contain. William Arthur Watkins Strachan, or simply Billy Strachan, who you can see on the picture of the right-hand side of the slide, which you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here, was born in Kingston, Jamaica in 1921. He came to London in March 1940 to join the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. He first became an air gunner and finally climbed up the ranks to become a flight lieutenant. After the Second World War ended, he briefly returned to Jamaica, but he soon returned to England in 1947. Back in London, Strachan became politically active on behalf of the West Indies community in the home countries and the diaspora. One of these activities included that Strachan attended the Caribbean Labour Congress in Trinidad in 1947. And this at the time was in the British Caribbean, the most radical organisation of trade unionism that existed. He agreed to set up a branch of the Caribbean Labour Congress in the capital of the empire itself in London. So after he had founded that branch of the Caribbean Labour Congress, he also was elected as the secretary of the London branch himself. Another interesting aspect of his life is that just a month after the Empire Windrush's arrival in June of 1948, he helped organise meetings for the new passengers who arrived at the Holborn Town Hall to offer them help and advice as newly arrived migrants. He also became a member of the Communist Party, and in 1952 he also launched the first left-wing newspaper for Caribbean people living in Britain, which was called the Caribbean News. He was actively involved in many anti-racist and anti-colonial movements to fight for the independence of the West Indies from the British Empire throughout the 20th century as well. So along with people like Fenner Brockway, Kay Beauchamp and Tony Gilbert, he founded the movement for colonial freedom. And he was also very closely involved with the leaders of Caribbean independence, such as Guyana, Chedi Jagan, and those who supported them from the UK as well. Again, people such as Fenner Brockway and Claudia Jones as well. The papers of his that we hold in the Institute of Commonwealth Studies archives evidence his broad-ranging activities and interests throughout his life. The archives include many materials on not only the activities of the Caribbean Labour Congress and its various branches, but also materials relating to Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, the West Indies Federation, and as it was called in British Guyana, but what is now just Guyana. It also features many documents on racism and discrimination in Britain against the Caribbean and West Indies community. It will feature some materials on the Race Relations Board, and anti-colonialism and independence movements within the Caribbean are featured heavily as well. So for this session, what I basically did is search for the term London in the Billy Strachan papers, and I came across naturally several big files of the Caribbean Labour Congress London branch. But I also found 2 files that were entitled Afro-Caribbean People in the UK, and also some newspapers that form part of the archive. And on the following slides, I will just give you some examples of newspapers that form part of this archive and how they can give us some insight into Black London of the 20th century. So on the slide here, you can see some editions of the Carib on the left, the Afro-West Indian Clarion in the middle, and on the right-hand side, the Caribbean Workers' Weekly from the 50s, and these are all from the 50s and 60s. All of these were published at London addresses, so the Caribbean Workers' Weekly and the Carib were both published on the top floor of 374 Gray's Inn Road, and the Afro-West Indian Clarion was printed by Plough Press in 18 Clapham High Street. And this shows us a quite good evidence of how there is an increasing publishing activity aimed at the growing Caribbean and West Indian community in London. And these publications also give us some insight into the issues that affected Black Londoners during this time. So you can't really see this very well because the images are very big, but in the Afro-West Indian Clarion, for example, on the edition that we are showing here from June-July 1957, the main article has the headline "Probe on Colonial Scandalous Infringement of Civic Rights," and it concerns and I quote here, "private memorandum from the Home Office which ordered a police probe into the lives of coloured people living in Britain," end quote. So this is just one of many examples of reports of how migrant communities in the mid-20th century in Britain were often singled out by authorities and experienced acts of discrimination and racism against them. However, the article also goes on to say that, and I quote again, "after holding down by armed force the colonial people, after robbing and persecuting them so much that cold and antisocial London seems a better proposition than life in the colonies, these very same exploiters confront West Indians in London." And the article also further says that here in Britain we shall take our rightful place in the struggle of the working class, end quote. So from the language used here, and considering that Billy Strachan's had like communist political convictions, and finding these publications leaned strongly towards his left-wing communist viewpoints among his papers doesn't really come as a surprise. But what I find interesting about these papers is that it also shows how a lot of left-wing communist theory was strongly underpinning anti-racist movements, and often by extension movements against British imperial power and colonial oppression. All of the newspapers that you see on this slide here regularly reported on political developments in the home countries of their readers as well. And they established this intrinsic connection between the struggles of the Black community at home and abroad. So these newspapers are not just nice examples of a means of reporting and disseminating news to a community, but they're also an activist tool to support the struggles of the Black community in Britain and overseas. Let's move on to the next slide here to show you another example of a newspaper that you can find in the archive. So this here is the West Indian Gazette from December 1960. The West Indian Gazette was founded in 1958 by an acquaintance of Strachan, Claudia Jones, who I mentioned previously. She was a Trinidadian-born communist, a political activist, feminist, and Black nationalist, and she arrived in Britain in 1955. She edited the West Indian Gazette again from a London address in Brixton, in 250 Brixton Road. And the West Indian Gazette became really successful at the time, and it has been described as Britain's first major Black newspaper. Like the other 3 newspapers I showed you in the previous slide, the West Indian Gazette often reported on developments of the international Black community, but also on issues that affected it in Britain itself. So again, it's a bit too small for you to see, but on this slide, or in this paper, there is a report which has the headline, "West Indians Face Eviction," which recounts how several people were facing evictions at an address in West London. One of the less obvious and I think quite intriguing ways of how these newspapers can show us something about the Black London community, there is actually the adverts in these newspapers. So on this slide, I've just added a few of the ones that you can see in this December 1960s edition of the West Indian Gazette. I think these adverts illustrate really nicely how there is a quite prominent economy and social space surrounding the community forming at the time. So just going from left to right, as you can see, the first one is for an advertisement of the British Caribbean Association's annual Christmas Ball, which was held at Kensington Town Hall. There's also quite a lot of adverts for specialist food shops that were popping up around London. And the third advertisement shows basically that a certain hair product was arriving in Britain for the first time and was encouraging people to buy that. And then on the very right-hand side, you can see that there is a directory of different addresses of shops and other places where people could turn to for their various daily needs and their needs for living a life in the capital. So what we can see here is that newspapers such as the West Indian Gazette became a focal point to bring together a growing community. And they also show us how the Black community was forming their own spaces within the capital. So they're quite nice illustrations of how Black London, if you will, was forming at the time. So these are just a few examples of what you can find in our archives and that you can use for researching this topic. If you want to find out more about the contents of the archive, I'd recommend that you have a look at our archives catalogue, where you can find details on all the archives of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies as well. And I'll just stop presenting and start sharing my screen with you so I can show you that in more detail. So if you wanted to search the archives catalogue for the Billy Strachan papers in particular and find out more about them, what you should be doing best is going on the search bar here. You should go to the advanced search, and the Billy Strachan papers, as all other archives, have a particular reference code, and the Billy Strachan papers can be found under the reference code ICS 158. So if you search by this reference code, you will be able to see all the other papers that are in this archive. And most of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies archives do start with an ICS. So if you want to have an explore around other archives, that might be another good way to find your way around, even though it might return a lot of results. But this can be a quite good starting point for you to explore the archives. I should also note that you are able to view archival materials in our special collections room only, and you have to request them in advance. But if you want to see any of these papers, feel free to get in touch with our special collections team, and they'll be very happy to help you. Another thing I wanted to quickly show you is that we have a lot of pamphlets in our collection that used to be in Billy Strachan's ownership, which you can explore through our library catalogue. So I've already performed the search that returns all of the pamphlets, but if you wanted to do this yourself, you would just have to select the author search in the catalogue, and then you have to type in this term here, which is Strachan, Billy, former owner, and that will return you all the results of the pamphlets that Billy Strachan used to own. So if you're interested in finding out more what sort of materials he read, that's another good way of looking into it further. So now that I've given you a glimpse into the archives, I will now just conclude my part of the session by showing you an example of an e-resource that you can use through Senate House Library to research Black London history. So, and for that, I'm going to be showing you our A to Z databases list that we have linked on our website. So this is a list of all the e-resources that you have access to via Senate House with a library membership. On this list, we have created a category which is for Black histories and studies. So if you want to find this category, you have to go to all subjects. And here you will just have to select the category of Black histories and studies. And that way you will be able to see all the 14 e-resources that we have available for that topic. To give you an example of how you might be able to use an e-resource for your research, I will be showing you one of the ones that we have a subscription to, which is Black Studies Centre, which you can find under the letter B here. So you will have to be logged into your library account to use this. So I'm already logged in, but if you were not logged in yet, you would have to log in with the name that you signed up for a library membership for, as well as your library membership number that you received when you signed up. And here is the Black Studies Centre. And just to explain what it is, it's a fully cross-searchable gateway to Black Studies, which includes scholarly essays, periodicals, historical newspapers, reference books, multimedia content, and many other things. It basically is there to bring together essential historical and current material on researching the past, present, and future of African Americans, the wider African diaspora, and Africa itself. So the description that it gives you already indicates that it is mainly a resource for US Black history, but despite that, you might still be able to find materials on London Black history in it. So if we just go and perform a search on London with the search function here, so even if this is not necessarily a resource focused on Black British history, you can still see that the term London returns several results in several different categories. So it returns things in the essays category, the readings category, the multimedia category, and so on. I'm just going to show you one of the entries that it has returned in the essays to get us a bit of a better sense of what kind of material we can find. And here's the list of results that were returned when we search for London in the essays category. So as you can see here, you will get the author of the result, the title of the result, and the date of publication. But one of the useful things that it also does is it gives you the occurrence of the term London in the text itself, and around it there's a few words that it sits in context in. So this can give you a good sense of if an entry might or may not be helpful for your research. And I'm just going to have a closer look at one of the entries here. So this refers to something held in London during the summer of. So let's have a look at what that refers to here. So this is an article on African American nationalism. So at first it might not seem that this has much to do with Black London history at all. However, if we scroll down to where the term London occurs, and this will again be marked in red, here we go. So we can see here that it has a reference to the speech that W.E.B. Du Bois gave at the first Pan-African Conference, which was held in London in the summer of 1900. So it's just a small piece of information, but this can lead you to learning more about events and developments in the history of London that you may not have been aware of, and it might prompt you to look into the other aspects of this history further. So in addition to reading your usual articles for your course or your books, or searching through archival materials like you just did, searching for a new resource like this can give you another useful tool to gather a bit more information about the history of Black London and its international connections to the Black community as well.
So that's all from me for now, and I will now hand you back over to Layla, who will introduce you to the Senate House Library literature collections that you can use to study Black London.
So I'm going to highlight to you a selection of Senate House Library's print and electronic resources on Black London literature. And these are just some examples which I hope provide you with a taster of the material held in our collections. And I'm going to begin with the library's extensive print collections. So the literary representation of Black London features in both our special collections, which contain rare and older material, and in our modern collections of loanable books, primarily in our English literature and Anglophone Caribbean literature collections, where primary texts sit alongside many secondary critical works to support study and research. And the first slide here represents both these collections, with two primary texts spanning the 18th to the 21st centuries, and an example of literary criticism. So the first image on the screen here shows one of our copies of the first edition of Olaudah Equiano's interesting narrative of his life, which the title page tells us was printed for and sold by the author at number 10 Union Street in 1789 while he was living in London. The work became a bestseller and influential in the abolitionist movement, and it is a work which transcends disciplinary boundaries, being both an example of lived history and autobiography, which includes his life in London, where he also became friends with fellow abolitionist Ottobah Cugoano, whose 1787 anti-slavery treatise is also held in our special collections. And as a related aside, we also subscribe to an e-resource called The Making of the Modern World, which contains digitised primary texts from various libraries, including Senate House, and our copies of Equiano and Cugoano's texts are both on that resource. The final two items here were published over 220 years after Equiano's text. The middle image is of a 2017 collection of poetry by the London poet Keith Jarrett, entitled Selah, which clearly lays out its London territory with the map on the front cover. And the final book on this slide shows an example of the literary criticism related to Black London texts, which here links two chroniclers of London life, Charles Dickens and Zadie Smith, in analysis of the literature of suburbia. But in addition to literary studies, the library specialises in works on book history research. So I thought one way to show you further examples of Black British writing is to reflect also on some of Juanita's comments and look within our print collections to consider the publishers of the books. In considering Black London writing in this way, a social history of literary production runs alongside the textual meanings as it becomes apparent where and by whom Black literary voices were given a platform. So on this next slide are just a handful of paperbacks from our collections, and I'm just going to go through them, moving sort of from left to right. So moving along the screen, we first have Black Eye Perceptions, which is a pamphlet published in 1980 by the Brixton-based community press Black Ink Collective, which encouraged young Black Londoners to express themselves in poetry, sketches and stories. This is just one collection of their output from the young authors. The writer John Agard highlighted in the introduction to Living Room, which is another Black Ink publication we hold, that Black Ink was an alternative to straight, established publishing houses, which were reluctant to give space to Black writers. And next to this is an image from a very recent example of community publishing, authors of the Estate Chalk Hill edition from the London Borough of Brent-based group Freedom and Balance. Freedom and Balance work within their communities, providing, and I quote, an art college for the artist in everyone, running workshops and producing books such as this one, containing the voices of residents of a particular housing estate, in this instance Chalk Hill. One of Freedom and Balance's key aims is to question who has the authority to be an author. The next image is of perhaps one of the most studied and read novels of Black London life in the 1950s, The Lonely Londoners by Samuel Selvon, a Trinidadian writer of Indian heritage. Now available as a Penguin Modern Classic, this edition is from the Caribbean Writers series, which was published by Heinemann and then Longman. This series followed the model of the earlier African Writers series to publish affordable paperback texts, making works from the Caribbean and Caribbean diaspora available to a wide audience. The next book is In the Ditch, which is Buchi Emecheta's 1972 semi-autobiographical novel of single motherhood in North London during the 1960s. Born in Lagos, Emecheta came to London as a young woman, where she studied sociology and became a novelist. The book has been published in many editions, and this copy is the 1979 edition published by Allison and Busby, which is the company that Juanita mentioned earlier that was co-founded by Margaret Busby, Britain's youngest and first female Black publisher. The recent PEN Pinter Prize winner Linton Kwesi Johnson's poetry book Dread, Beat and Blood is next. And this book was published in 1975 by Bogle Louverture, the press based in Ealing and founded by Eric and Jessica Huntley. The press also had a bookshop, which provided an outlet for the distribution of these texts and also a meeting place. And the bookshop was renamed in 1980 in honour of the recently assassinated Guyanese historian, political activist and academic Walter Rodney. And finally, the last book here is by Beryl Gilroy, whose Black Teacher, about her experiences teaching in London, is perhaps her most famous work. The book shown here is one of her novels, which is largely set in London and which has been described as a Caribbean woman's her story. It is published by People Tree Press, which was founded in 1985 and now publishes about 20 titles a year, including their Caribbean Modern Classics series. These texts, all centred on and published in London, provide us with not only wonderful literature, but also a snapshot of creative publishing from within London's Black communities. Now, I want to highlight to you 2 online resources, one ebook and one online journal, which are both accessible to Senate House Library members via our catalogue and which support the study of Black London literature. And to do this, I'm just going to go briefly online and first of all show you the journal Wasafiri, which is here, which has been in print since its foundation in 1984. Containing a mix of creative writing and poetry, discussions and interviews and critical articles, Wasafiri was founded to provide outlets for, and I quote from their website, writers from African, Caribbean, Asian and Black British backgrounds who often struggle to get adequate attention in the mainstream press. We have the print journal in the library from its foundation and subscribe to the full text online, which is here available from 1998 onwards. Once you're on the site, you have a number of options. You can read particular issues. As you can see down the page here, you get all the volumes and issues, including the most recent one, which we can have a look at here, which is volume 35. And when you browse through these issues, you will find that they contain a lot of material that is related to Black London. So this is the most recent one here, which came out 3rd issue of 2020. And if I just browse down the articles there, you can see the kind of things, and you'll see that there is an interview here with Alex Wheatle, who talks about his new novel for young adults, Cane Warriors. It's called The Reggae Roots and the Brixton Bard. The other thing that you can do is search across the whole journal. You don't need to look at a specific issue if you don't want to. So for instance, we could search the aforementioned Beryl Gilroy. Let me spell her name properly. And just search across there. And there's lots of material here about Beryl Gilroy, and these results return, for example, an interview with her, which has come here at the top. There's an article about her work, Black Teacher, and there's also an extract on here of the novel I mentioned earlier, In Praise of Love and Children. Now, the founder of Wasafiri, Sushila Nasta, is also one of the editors of the ebook I'm going to show you now, which is here. We subscribe to the online versions of Cambridge Histories, which are a series of books published by Cambridge University Press containing essays on multiple subjects across the humanities and social sciences. Published in December 2019, the Cambridge History of Black and Asian British Writing is a collection of essays covering the 18th century to date and containing works by numerous writers and scholars on a wide range of authors and topics. You have various options. When you get to the book's homepage, you can read the entire book, going chapter by chapter. Or, of course, you could skip through the various chapters, which all have links, live links to them down here, and they're roughly chronological. And many of these have distinct relevance to the study of Black London literature, including, for instance, this one here, The Lure of Post-War London, which considers the 1950s and 1960s and does so in the light of literary publishing for Black writing in London. Now, although it's not possible to download the entire book, you can download one chapter from it. And another way in which this book is a really useful resource is for its bibliography. And I'm just going to go to that, which is at the end, obviously. And this can also be downloaded. It's the select bibliography here. And this can be downloaded as a separate chapter. And let's just have a look at the PDF, because this bibliography of works referenced in this ebook acts in itself as a nice reading list of both primary and secondary texts relating to Black British literature, much of it stemming for or related to London, and in itself is a really useful resource and one that I've also downloaded and are going to check our collections against as well. So that's the end of what I wanted to talk about literature, and I think we've come to sort of 10 minutes towards the end, but before we go to questions, I'm just going to pass back over again to Argala, who's going to say a final few words.
Thank you, Layla. What I really wanted to just add is our contact details. So here are all our contact details that you are very welcome to use to get in touch with us after the session.